Hello again, my glorious undergraduates. We are on the second to the last lecture for EDC 312. Today's topic is going to be instructional strategies. So, let's talk about how do you plan your instruction. I apologize for the dogs barking in the background. It is what it is. Alright, so when it comes time to start planning your instruction, you've got a great idea for a lesson you want to teach, unit you want to do, a topic you want to get into. It's time to start thinking about what does that process look like. So the first thing you want to do is identify what information, knowledge, skills, abilities you want your students to get. Thing number one, what do you want them to be able to do, or what do you want them to know? Before the end of the lesson, basically. And then you've got to decide what order, it says sequence here, but order is fine, in which you're going to teach all that, which is sometimes the hard part, to be honest. And usually as a new teacher, you're just kind of figuring that out as you go. Sometimes textbooks can help you figure it out, because they have their own pacing guides, and sometimes older, more experienced teachers who have taught it before can help you out. But it's definitely something that is kind of a struggle for a newer teacher sometimes. And then you start making the lessons, and those are, you doing a little instruction, maybe doing some activities. That's basically it. That's the three main things to planning instruction. So, where'd you put that? On present mode to make it bigger for you. There you go. Right? Okay, so, a lot of times we start with something called a task analysis. It's basically a roadmap. Tells you where you're going to start, what you're going to pass on the way, and where you're going to end up. So, the idea is not to assume what your students know already, but to actually kind of know it. You have to kind of take some time to look into their prior knowledge, and then it may also help you figure out kind of how you want to proceed, how you want to teach. Okay, so, we talked about this a little bit with assessment before, and it also applies in terms of instruction. So, if you're gonna do some instruction design, you want to start with backwards design. You want to start by identifying what the end result is going to be. What do you want your students to be able to do? What do you want them to be able to produce? What do you want them to be able to know? So, I did the example of voting in previous videos, right? So if, let's say we're still doing our lesson on voter registration, and I want to do it backwards design planning, this is exactly the same procedure as it would be for an assessment. I'm going to go, what do I want students to be able to do at the end of this lesson? Well, what I want them to be able to do at the end of this lesson is explain the process of becoming a registered voter wherever it is they are. Right? And so I've created this great assessment that I think will get us there. That's thing number one. Right? Which bleeds into thing number two. So, I've decided what assessment I want, cumulatively at the end of the class, or what summative assessment I may want. But I've also decided, hopefully, on some formative assessments that can happen throughout the class. And, we got to make sure those actually are measuring the skills and the knowledge that I want students to have. And then, I'm going to plan instruction that will help students get to those assessment tasks. Right? We practice the way we play, basically. Not to get all sportsy on you, but you want to practice well so that when it comes time for the game, in our case, an assessment, you're ready to go. Right? So, once you've got your assessment figured out, we kind of start by thinking about instructional objectives. So first and foremost, you want to determine what you want your students to be able to do. And then you want to make sure that it's specific and measurable. So we've talked a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy. You can absolutely use that. And then also depth of knowledge is another way to look at it. And then, instructional objectives are always written from the student's perspective. It's always written in the language of the student will be able to, the student will know, the student will understand. It's never the teacher will have given an excellent presentation on voter registration. It might be something like the student will be able to explain how to become a registered voter in their state. Something to that effect. Okay, so here's a little bit on Bloom's taxonomy. We've looked at it a bit before, but it comes in handy when you're talking about instruction design in a way that it doesn't always come in handy in other places. So, Bloom's taxonomy here is represented as a pyramid. And if you start at the bottom, which is the base of the pyramid, that's where the vast majority of a lot of people's instruction is going to hang out. Tapering all the way up to creating, which is a very small piece of instruction most of the time. And it's a bit of a hierarchy. It kind of does take remembering to get to understanding, to get to applying, to get to analyzing. It's a bit of a ladder, too. So remembering is just recalling knowledge and having it stuffed in your long-term memory. Now that needs to happen most of the time before you can get to understanding, which is making sense of what you learned. And then you can't really do applying without remembering and understanding. So you've recalled the knowledge, you've made sense of it, and now you're able to use it, right? So that's applying. And then analyzing is when you can analyze how it all works together, like the different parts of how something comes together. Which if you can do that, you can move on to evaluating. And that's where you make judgments based on whatever the guidelines are about the thing you've learned or the problem you're looking at or the product that you're being asked to make. And then once you can do all that, we can ask you to create. So that is taking all those processes at the bottom of the pyramid and turning them into something new and creative and innovative. Now, like I said, most instruction is going to hang out in the first three categories, especially when you're talking about younger students or when you're talking about basic skills. I taught Spanish for so many years, and because I mostly taught Spanish 1 and 2, we stayed an awful lot in the remembering and understanding categories, because at first students were just trying to recall vocabulary, and then after that they were trying to understand that vocabulary when it came at them in the form of writing or spoken Spanish. And after a while, maybe in Spanish 2, you could get more into the applying category, right? You've learned a whole lot of vocabulary, you have a lot built up, and so now you can really start using it, trying to do more conversation, trying to do more written work, etc. We didn't usually get too high into analyzing, evaluating, or creating in those classes because the topic we were on was fairly basic, and students really just needed a basic foundation. However, in Spanish 3 and 4, which was mostly populated by either really advanced learners of Spanish or heritage or native speakers of Spanish, we could go higher. We didn't have to spend quite as much time on the lower part of the pyramid because they kind of already had that going for them language-wise, and therefore we could analyze things. We could read books, we could talk about history, we could talk about culture, we could watch movies in Spanish and not just be like, please give me a summary of what happened, but we could really evaluate the movie. How good was this movie? And do you think it was historically accurate? And then we could create things. One of the things that I loved to do every year was the lessons on Day of the Dead. And, you had to have all those other things in place before you could really start creating, but I always had students make, informative and often very artistic projects. So, eventually you can move up the ladder, and sometimes you can do all of this in one class. It doesn't have to be broken up into like various classes the way it ended up being for me in Spanish. Ideally, in any given lesson, you're going to hit a lot of these. You may not get to creating. You may not get to evaluating. But we like to see you working your way up that taxonomy because it's challenging. The first 3 categories are, of course, challenging, but nowhere near as challenging as the top half of the pyramid. So, if your instruction as an educator is pretty much always hanging out at the bottom of the pyramid, you're probably not challenging your students in the way that you should be. Right? And you have to adjust based on, developmentally appropriate stuff, depending on how old your students are, how experienced they are, and that sort of thing. But that's just a little bit about blooms. Okay, so you got your instructional strategy. It should reflect what you decided in your task analysis. You need to be thinking all the time about what your students already know how to do and whether or not some of it needs to be reviewed. And even if it doesn't need to be reviewed, it might also just need like a quick refresher or reminder about it. You might just have to refer to it, bring their attention to it so that they're in that headspace before you start the lesson. You may have to give them some guidance. Kids may be experiencing something new, like working in a lab. But generally your instructional strategy should point towards your instructional objectives. And as always, it also should consider the learning needs of your students, whatever those may be. All right, so generally you want to pick your methods based on what you're going to use them for. So introducing new information is a whole different animal than like having students apply knowledge. Some activities are better for instructing on new stuff, and some activities are just better for practice. So knowing the difference is pretty important. And then some things can either be teacher-centered or student-centered. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Teacher-centered being the teacher's in charge, the teacher is the one doing most of the work. All attention is on the teacher, where student or learner-centered is very different. The students are more in charge of what's happening. They tend to be working more independently. Like the teacher is there to help them, but really only in a facilitating kind of role, much less, it's not a sage on the stage kind of thing where everybody has to pay attention to the teacher the whole time. Now the students are actually doing the vast majority of what's necessary for the activity. You got to keep in mind those different learning styles, visual, kinesthetic, auditory, whatever it may be. And the type of knowledge that this is, procedural, declarative, conditional. And then you also need to know too, like, are my students novices? Are they very new at this? Or are they experts? Like, they totally know this. Or somewhere in the middle. Because your instructional strategy for a new person would be very different than your instructional strategy for someone who is an expert. For example, if I want to work on spelling in Spanish with a person who is very new, then we have to start with the ABCs. They have to learn what the names of the ABCs are. They have to learn what sounds they make when you see them in a letter or like in a word. And that will help with pronunciation. Okay, but if someone is like an expert at pronunciation and they already sort of have a sense of what letters make what sounds in Spanish, then I definitely don't have to start with the ABCs. We'll start somewhere down the line. Just application, basically. I give them a word, I say it in Spanish, and they tell me how they think it's spelled. But you can't do that with a new person. That would be very overwhelming and totally not within their zone of proximal development, right? So it's very important to make sure that you know, like, what the level of your students is before you really dive into your instruction. Okay, so when we talk about instruction, we also talk about it being, we talked a minute ago about it being teacher-centered or student-centered, but we also talk about it being teacher-directed or student-directed, right? So centered tells me whose ideas and understanding we're working with in this lesson that is to be done, right? So most of the thinking is coming from who? Most of the idea that is out there is coming from who? So teacher-centered would be, I, the teacher, am doing most of the thinking. I'm presenting the ideas and the concepts, and students are supposed to take what I tell them, ingest it, and make it their own. All right? So they're empty buckets into which I'm pouring my knowledge. That would be a teacher-centered situation. A student-centered situation, however, would be where the ideas come from the students. And they're actually trying to work with and make sense of their ideas before we jump into anything I want to do as the teacher. You know, we take student learning preferences into consideration. Again, the teacher is like facilitating this conversation, but not taking it over. There's a really good video here that I will not show you now, but you could take a look at that and it'll show you kind of what that looks like in person. Right? So some examples of something that might be teacher-centered is when a teacher assigns a book for all the students to read. But a student-centered approach to that would be letting the students pick the book. Right? It's not my idea of what book we should read, it's the student's idea of what book we should read. And when we speak about directed, that's who's controlling the process. Who's running the show? Is it me, the teacher, or the students? Right? And then, let's not think this is a dichotomy here. It doesn't have to be it's either the teacher or the student directed. No. It's a continuum. It's a spectrum, if you will. Like, there can be a combination of both, student-directed and teacher-directed in any given class. And you can mix in teacher-centered and student-centered things. Like, generally speaking, most lessons will be a mix of these, right? To go back to the example there, ask who is choosing the method of learning, and that will tell you whether something is teacher-directed or student-directed. So if it's teacher-directed, I told you had to read a chapter and do all those end-of-chapter questions like our reading guides. But then something student-directed would be like if the students read the chapter and then they had a discussion about it that I was not directly leading. So this chart here kind of gives you a sense of where things fall on that spectrum or that continuum I was talking about. So if the authority, comes from the teacher or a textbook, that's kind of teacher-centered, teacher-directed. But if the authority rests with the student, that could be more student-centered or more student-directed. So, you've got some options here. You have direct instruction, which, is what I do every time I lecture. So, modeling is one thing. That is teacher-directed and usually teacher-centered. That's me showing you how to do something. Coaching is also like that. Tends to be teacher-directed and teacher-centered. But usually usually the student is doing something. So modeling is me showing you how to do it. Coaching is me letting you do it, but directing you and giving you input. And then here's the step we love to get to as teachers. This is the goal right here. The fade. We love it. So basically fade is when, I've given you something teacher-directed, but it is student-centered, right? It's your own thinking, it's your own whatever, and I get to go hands-off. For the most part. I start you out, and then I can walk away. We love that. We love when students get so independent that they don't need us. That's like the whole goal, right? If I teach you well enough, you can do it on your own. So fate is walking toward that, usually. And then you've got launch, which is teacher-directed and student-centered. I get you started, but the whole process is yours to do. Exploring, which is both student-directed and student-centered. That's a little scary for a lot of novice teachers. Because one of the mistakes that most very new teachers make is trying to keep so much control of what's going on in the classroom. Because, we're always afraid that the principal will come by and think our class is out of control. Or, you're just worried that if you don't keep a tight lid on things, stuff may go out of control, and then where are you? Right? So, and stuff does happen. Just to tell you a little story from my time as a Spanish teacher. We did this cool activity in class one time. We were learning the words for on top of, next to, behind, things like that. And, so we did this thing where we sent a student out into the hall. And while we had them out in the hall, we would hide an object. And when the student came back in, they had to ask questions of the class in Spanish, like, is it next to this? Is it behind this? And then, the class would answer C or no. And then eventually, hopefully, the person would figure out where the object was. Well, one time I put the object on top of a very tall bookshelf. And let's be honest about how the bookshelves in most classrooms are not like the sturdiest things you've ever seen, mainly because they've probably been there for 30 or 40 years. So anyways, I put this thing on top of the bookshelf, and the student comes in and asks a bunch of questions and finally realizes that the item in question is on top of the bookshelf, which is probably like 8 feet tall, give or take. The student does not make a good choice in that moment and think, ooh, I should get a chair to stand on to reach this thing. Oh, no. The student is so excited to have found the object that he decides the best way to claim said object would be to literally climb the shelves. Now, I'll have you know that these shelves are only held in by tiny pegs, and they are also full of textbooks and game pieces and art stuff and everything else you would use in a classroom. And when that young man stepped onto those shelves and started to climb them, the entire set of shelves fell, spilling things everywhere, darn near hitting kids in that row with cards and books and things, making an almighty kaboom that could be heard all the way upstairs. My classroom was downstairs. That could be heard all the way upstairs. The principal came running from her office upstairs to see what was happening. It was an absolute disaster. All that to say, stuff happens. You can, sometimes when you get in that explore phase where you're letting students direct and center their own learning, you can have some stuff happen, right? And it's your job as the teacher to sort of hopefully foresee those things and stave them off before they happen. Like, imagine I had said no climbing on the furniture under any circumstances before we started this game. But it was the first time we had done it, and I didn't realize students would climb on the furniture. So, I learned from that, and every time after that, I would be like, okay, here's what you're not gonna do, right? So, yeah, there's a little bit of risk, if you will, in letting students explore, because you never know what direction they're gonna take things in, or to what extent. But it's also where some of the coolest learning happens. So don't, as a new teacher, make a mistake in never letting students live in that exploring space. Summarizing is teacher-directed and student-centered. And then there's some other things that are self-directed that students can do, like a research project is both student-directed and student-centered, especially if they get to choose the topic that they want to research. And then experiential learning, which would encompass things like job shadows, internships. Those are both student-directed and student-centered because generally they're chosen by the student and tailored to what the student is interested in, and usually not actually overseen, directly by a teacher. All right, here's how to tell the difference between something teacher-centered versus student and learner-centered, right? You know, does the student have a choice, yes or no? If they do have a lot of choice, then that's going to be student-centered. Is the student passive or are they active? If they're passive, that's probably teacher-centered. If they're active, it's definitely student-centered, right? So, is the focus on the instructor? Hi, that's teacher-centered. If the focus is on the student and the instructor, then that's learner-centered, right? So, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this chart, but definitely feel free to look at it on your own, because this may be coming in handy for you in your lesson plan, because I would love it if you would tell me whether your activities are going to be more student-centered or more teacher-centered. Right? That would be great. That would be good details. So if you want to take a look at what teacher-directed instruction looks like, where the teacher's calling the shots, then take a look at that YouTube video, which you can find in the slideshow on Brightspace. I recommend it. It's a pretty good little video. So here's some examples of teacher-directed methods. Lecture, which I'm doing now. Direct instruction, which I'm also kind of doing now. Anything that's computer-based, like Khan Academy, stuff like that. Any type of teacher-driven questioning and discussion. And then anything that counts as mastery learning would also fall under that category. Some stuff that falls under the category of learner-directed instruction would be anything that counts as cooperative learning. If you have students in groups or in pairs or something like that working on something, that's cooperative learning. Information literacy, hypermedia, like if you have them doing something like a web quest on the internet, any kind of peer tutoring where you've got students teaching each other, exploring discoveries, and then authentic activities like service learning, or, in the case of a Spanish class, it might have been something like, I taught you how to order your lunch from a restaurant. And then I set up an activity where you had to simulate ordering your lunch from a restaurant. Or even better, maybe I took you to a restaurant and you had to order your lunch in Spanish. That's best case scenario, because that is the most authentic. But, school budgets being what they are, you can't always make that happen. But we do like to get as close to authentic as we can. I'm not going to talk you through this, but feel free to look at this lovely set of beautiful circles, because it will give you some ideas under each individual category of different activities that you might do in your own lesson plan. So feel free to come back to this at some point. We are not going to talk about it just now so much. This is also just a whole bunch of examples of stuff, whatever counts as direct instruction. Right? I like the thing on the right because it very much kind of lets you see how the usual trajectory of direct instruction goes. So, you introduce or review something, and then usually what comes next is modeling, where you show students what you want them to be able to do. You get them examples, you explain. And then guided practice, where, you are monitoring the practice. You're walking around and looking at, them doing these tasks you've assigned them. And then generally closure, so you highlight what you talked about, you kind of go full circle, and then boom, it's over. Now, the next two steps are represented as kind of being outside of an individual lesson plan here, like, because they come after closure. But I don't want you to think that they can't happen inside the lesson, because they absolutely can. But I think this model assumes that independent practice will come in the form of homework. So that's why it's sort of past the closure of the lesson plan. But you can also have independent practice during your lesson. Yeah, so, you give them a task to do that is independent. You don't help them with it. Simple. And then evaluation is where you assess their progress, which I think from our assessment lecture that, you can be doing that as you go through the lesson. It doesn't have to be, formative assessments. It doesn't have to be like something that happens outside of your lesson plan. So, and there's also indirect instruction where you give the students some sort of responsibility for learning on their own. If you've ever heard of the flipped classroom method, where students are meant to learn things on their own outside of class, and then when they're in class, they practice, that would be indirect instruction. There's some other things here for you to look at that count as indirect instruction. Here's a little look at experiential learning. Here's what we hope experiential learning will be. We hope it will be integrated and thematic. Like, it should be part of what else is going on in your lesson or in your unit, not something totally separate. It should be real world stuff. It should be problem based. It should be brain based, and it should be hands on, right? In order to be experiential, it pretty much needs to be hands on. So it goes in a cycle. You experience the activity, you do it, and then you share the results, talk about, how it went, what you learned, process all that, you look at it, you reflect, you generalize that experience to other things that are going on in the world, and then you can apply it to a different situation that might be similar. There is such a thing as independent study. I've done an awful lot of that as a PhD candidate. And then there's also interactive instruction. They give you an example here of a role-playing game, right? Making students part of the instruction, which is a pretty cool idea. Also games. Games are interactive instruction, believe it or not. So you see students in a classroom playing a game and you think, oh, they're just having fun. And nope, sorry, that's interactive instruction. Thank you very much, principals who didn't get it. So, when you're doing your instructional practice and you're trying to set all this up, there are a lot of cultural considerations you want to think about. The dialect in which your students speak, the language that your students speak, so that you can be on their level, right? Talking versus silence in a classroom is very different in different cultures. In American culture, we often expect students to speak up and be interactive and be part of what's going on. But, like in a lot of Asian cultures, for example, that would be considered rude. Students are supposed to be quiet and respectful and listen to the teacher, right? So, if a student seems quiet and like they're not really engaged, it could just be a cultural difference. Asking questions. Some students will not ask you a question to save their lives because in their culture it's considered rude to do so. Like, asking you a question could be perceived as questioning your authority or saying that you're not a good teacher because obviously you explained it, and if they still have a question, that must mean that, they think you're a bad teacher, you didn't explain it right. So things like that can get in the way sometimes of students participating in the instruction. Answering questions, same thing. It's the same thing, really. Some students will not answer a question unless you ask them specifically because, speaking out of turn or like jumping up and shouting out an answer or even drawing attention to themselves by raising a hand and giving you the answer might feel like showing off to people in some cultures, and like that's frowned upon. So they're probably not going to volunteer to answer a question. But if you ask them a question directly because they respect you as the authority, they'll answer your question. So, if students are not talking back to you like you hope they will be when you throw a question out at the class, it might just be that they're trying to be respectful. It may not mean that they're not engaged. And then waiting versus interrupting. There are some cultures where it is totally normal to interrupt each other and talk over each other. I've been told by many Italians that that thing they do where they just all talk at the same time and somehow still understand what the other person is saying is like completely normal in Italian culture. But that would be so not normal in certain other cultures. Interrupting people for some cultures is like the height of rudeness. So disrespectful. So when it comes to a discussion, if there's not a designated time for that person to speak, they may not volunteer to speak, for fear of interrupting someone else and being rude. And these are just things that are good to remember. So, when you're watching a lesson happen, you're gauging how well it's going. You maybe aren't thinking, oh my God, this must be the worst lesson, the most boring lesson ever, because nobody's really working with me here. Okay, maybe you didn't take into consideration some cultural things. Maybe you didn't give those quiet kids who are afraid to be rude the opportunity to answer you in a visual way. Or designate a specific time for them to speak so that they know they're not going to be stepping on anybody's toes. These are things to remember, hopefully before you plan the lesson. But if you do plan the lesson and you find yourself bumping up against this sort of thing, then, just plan it differently for the next time. It's all a learning process. All right, so you got to think about differentiated instruction. This could be a whole class in and of itself. In fact, it kind of is. A lot of this will get talked about in, for example, a special ed kind of class for education majors. But, just keep in mind that not everybody learns the same way. And make sure that you are giving them a lot of different ways to learn. And that can be the content, like different ways of accessing the stuff you're actually teaching, the topic, or the process, like different ways of practicing, different ways of working to learn. And that can also be the product. So, like in my example about the voting registration, I could have them create a video, but I could also give them the option of doing a presentation or a slideshow. I could also give them the option of doing like an art project. I could give them the option of writing a little essay. That would be me differentiating in terms of the product. Right? So this is the final thing I want to say about instruction. There is no one way to do this right. Everything hinges on the students you have in front of you and the needs of the students that you have. So what works best for one class may not work for another. What works best for one lesson in the same class may not work for the next lesson. What works best for, students with an IEP or a disability of some kind may not work for students without. You just have to, it's all trial and error to an extent, right? And you have to really think about who the students are in front of you and what their needs are and what they know and what they're actually capable of doing. Right? Student-centered methods are generally the best because it creates a scenario where students have to activate parts of their brain that they might not normally use. And especially if you're trying to get them to think critically and independently, then the student-centered teacher methods are often the best for that. But however, you're going to need both. Because there are just some, the teacher-directed and learner-directed, because you can't rely on just one. And in any given lesson, you're probably going to switch between those two. And in any given unit, you're definitely going to switch between those two kinds of things all the time. So, we talk about best practices, but like the best practice is the one that works for the students you have in front of you. Or at least most of the students you have in front of you, right? And that is why we need a variety, because you're going to have a whole variety of students in front of you, right? that was a lot. I'm glad you're still with me. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Wow. Yeah, so I hope that helped you when you're going to be thinking about your instruction for your lesson plan. And I look forward to what will be our final lecture, which is on motivation, a little bit later on. So, I think that's all for today. Peace, y'all.